The mining station on Kepler 442c hummed with the constant vibration of extraction equipment deep beneath its surface. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck, watching the alien sunrise paint the rocky landscape in shades of copper and gold. 3 years she had been stationed here, overseeing the joint operation between Earth's Colonial Mining Corporation and the Zephyrian Trade Collective. The Zephyrians were an interesting species, tall, graceful beings with elongated limbs and gossamer wings that caught light like stained glass. Their society revolved around communal nests, vast structures that housed entire family units spanning multiple generations. What made them particularly fascinating to xenobiologists was their approach to child-rearing. Zephyrian cubs were raised collectively by the entire nest, with every adult taking responsibility for their protection and education. Sarah had grown fond of the Zephyrians during her tenure. Unlike many species humanity had encountered in their expansion into the galaxy, the Zephyrians showed genuine curiosity about human customs and technology. They were peaceful traders, excellent negotiators, and surprisingly adaptive to working alongside other species. The mining operation itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation. Human drilling technology combined with Zephyrian geological sensing abilities had increased ore extraction efficiency by 300%. The partnership was so successful that the Galactic Trade Commission had cited it as a model for future joint ventures. Sarah's communication device chimed with an incoming message from Earth Command. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing Admiral Morrison's weathered face. "Commander Chen, I have new orders for you," the Admiral began without preamble. "We're reassigning you to the Titan shipyards immediately. Transport arrives in 72 hours. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. She had grown attached to this place, to her work with the Zephyrians. "Sir, the mining operation is at a critical phase. The new deposits we discovered last month require—" "Your replacement is already en route," Morrison interrupted. "Commander Rodriguez has extensive mining experience. The transition should be seamless." Sarah nodded reluctantly. Orders were orders. "Understood, sir. I'll begin preparations immediately." As the communication ended, Sarah found herself looking out at the Zephyrian settlement visible in the distance. Their nest cities rose like organic sculptures from the planet's surface, their bioluminescent panels creating patterns that changed with the inhabitants' moods and activities. She would miss this place more than she cared to admit. The next 2 days passed in a blur of administrative tasks and handover procedures. Commander Rodriguez proved to be competent and thorough, asking all the right questions about the Zephyrian customs and the delicate balance of the operation. Sarah felt confident leaving the project in his hands. On her final evening, the Zephyrian Trade Collective held a farewell ceremony in her honor. The entire local population gathered in the main nest chamber, their wings creating a symphony of gentle rustling sounds. Elder Thys, the nest mother who had become something of a friend to Sarah, presented her with a crystalline sculpture that captured and refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. "You have brought honor to your species and ours," Elder Thys spoke in her melodic voice, the translator rendering her words in perfect English. "Your dedication to our mutual success will be remembered for generations." Sarah accepted the gift with genuine emotion. "The honor has been mine, Elder Thys. I've learned as much from your people as I hope I've contributed to our partnership." The ceremony continued with traditional Zephyrian songs and what could only be described as a wing dance, where dozens of adult Zephyrians moved in perfect synchronization, their gossamer appendages creating flowing patterns in the air. Sarah had seen this dance before, but never directed in her honor. It was deeply moving. As the evening wound down, Sarah made her way back to the human quarters for her final night on Kepler 442c. She had packed most of her belongings, leaving only essential items for her last day. Her military uniform hung in the closet, the same dress blues she had worn for important ceremonies and formal meetings with Zephyrian dignitaries. She decided to wear it one final time for her departure, as a mark of respect for the partnership she was leaving behind. The next morning arrived with the roar of approaching engines. The transport ship descended through the thin atmosphere, its bulk casting shadows across the mining facility. Sarah gathered her belongings and made her way to the landing pad, where a small crowd of human and Zephyrian workers had gathered to see her off. As she walked toward the transport, Sarah noticed something odd. A group of young Zephyrian cubs had gathered near the edge of the landing pad, their large, curious eyes fixed on her with unusual intensity. Zephyrian cubs were typically shy around other species, preferring to observe from a distance under the watchful protection of their caretakers. Elder Thys noticed Sarah's confusion. "The young ones have grown quite fond of you, Commander. Your interactions with our people have left a lasting impression on them." Sarah smiled and approached the cubs, kneeling down to their level. "I'll miss all of you too," she said gently. One of the cubs, bolder than the others, stepped forward and touched Sarah's uniform jacket with a delicate, three-fingered hand. The cub's eyes widened with what appeared to be wonder, and it chittered something in rapid Zephyrian that Sarah's translator couldn't quite catch. "What did he say?" Sarah asked Elder Thys. The elder's expression showed something that might have been amusement. "He asked if your protection shell makes you brave like the Nest Guardians." Sarah laughed softly. To a young Zephyrian, her military uniform must indeed look like some kind of protective covering. "Tell him that bravery comes from the heart, not from what we wear. But this uniform reminds me to be worthy of the trust others place in me." Elder Thys translated, and the cubs chittered excitedly among themselves. The transport pilot called out that they were ready for departure. Sarah stood, straightened her uniform one final time, and walked toward the ship. She paused at the ramp to wave goodbye to the assembled crowd, then disappeared into the vessel's interior. As the transport lifted off, Sarah looked through a porthole at the Zephyrian settlement growing smaller below. She had no way of knowing that her uniform had made such an impression on the cubs that they would talk about it for days afterward, or that Elder Thys was already planning to use Sarah's words about bravery and trust as a teaching story for the young ones. The ship broke atmosphere and engaged its jump drive, carrying Sarah away from Kepler 442c and toward her new assignment. Behind her, the mining operation continued its steady work, the partnership between humans and Zephyrians as strong as ever. In the Zephyrian settlement, the cubs gathered around Elder Thys, pestering her with questions about the human commander and her magnificent uniform. The elder smiled in her own way, recognizing a teaching moment when she saw one. But none of them, not even the wise Elder Thys, could have predicted what would happen to that uniform, or how it would come to represent something far greater than any of them had imagined. 6 months after Sarah's departure, Commander Rodriguez had settled into the rhythm of managing the mining operation. The work continued smoothly, with production quotas consistently being met or exceeded. The Zephyrians had accepted him readily enough, though he sensed they still held a special fondness for his predecessor. Rodriguez was reviewing the quarterly reports when his communication array crackled with an emergency signal. The transmission came from a Zephyrian exploration vessel operating in the outer system, and the distress in the pilot's voice was unmistakable even through the translation matrix. "Mining Station Alpha, this is Survey Ship Windwhisper requesting immediate assistance. We have suffered catastrophic engine failure and are adrift in the asteroid field. Our life support systems are failing, and we have civilians aboard, including younglings." Rodriguez immediately activated emergency protocols. "Windwhisper, this is Commander Rodriguez. We're launching rescue operations immediately. What's your exact position?" The coordinates came through garbled with static, but Rodriguez's navigation officer managed to pinpoint the vessel's location. It was deep in the dangerous Kepler belt, a maze of tumbling asteroids that made navigation treacherous even under the best circumstances. "Sir," Lieutenant Park reported from the sensor station, "the nearest Federation rescue ship is 8 hours away. The Zephyrian vessel won't last that long based on their life support readings." Rodriguez made the decision that would define his command. "Prep the emergency response shuttle. We're going in ourselves." Elder Thys arrived at the human section of the mining station within minutes of hearing the news. Her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of deep concern. "Commander, the Windwhisper carries 12 of our people, including 3 cubs on their first exploration journey. They are barely past their nest-binding age." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Rodriguez's shoulders. Zephyrian cubs were incredibly precious to their society. Losing even one would be a tragedy that could affect the entire nest for generations. Losing 3 would be catastrophic. "We'll get them out," Rodriguez promised, though privately he wondered if he could keep that promise. The rescue shuttle was designed for emergencies, but navigating the asteroid field would require precision piloting skills he wasn't sure he possessed. As the rescue team prepared their equipment, Elder Thiss approached Rodriguez with something unexpected in her delicate hands. It was a carefully preserved human military uniform, the same dress blues that Commander Chen had worn during her time on the station. She left this behind, Elder Thiss explained. It was discovered in her quarters after her departure. The cleaning staff were instructed to dispose of it, but the Cubs, they would not allow it. They have been guarding it as if it were a nest treasure. Rodriguez stared at the uniform, confused. I don't understand. Your predecessor spoke to our young ones about bravery and trust. She said that her uniform reminded her to be worthy of the trust others placed in her. The Cubs have adopted this as a truth teaching. They believe the uniform itself carries protective power. Rodriguez was about to dismiss this as simple superstition when Elder Thiss continued. I do not ask you to believe as the Cubs do, but they have requested that the uniform accompany the rescue mission. To them, it represents the human spirit of protection and courage. If you would allow this small comfort for our people. Rodriguez found himself nodding. If carrying an extra piece of clothing would give the Zephyrians hope, it seemed a small price to pay. Of course, we'll take it with us. The rescue shuttle launched 20 minutes later, with Rodriguez at the controls and a team of 3 specialists aboard. The carefully folded uniform sat in a protective case, treated with the reverence the Zephyrians clearly felt it deserved. Navigating the asteroid field proved even more challenging than anticipated. The tumbling rocks created a constantly shifting maze, their gravitational interactions unpredictable. Rodriguez found himself making split-second course corrections as house-sized boulders spun past their viewports. Contact, Lieutenant Park announced from the sensor station. I've got them on scope bearing 270 Mark 15, distance approximately 12 kilometers. The Windwhisper came into view as they rounded a particularly massive asteroid, a graceful vessel that looked more grown than built, its organic curves now marred by scorch marks and twisted metal. One entire section of the ship was dark, clearly without power. Windwhisper, this is the rescue shuttle Endeavor. Do you copy? The response came weakly through heavy static. Endeavor, blessed relief to hear your voice. We have lost main power and life support is failing rapidly. Our Cubs are becoming distressed. Rodriguez maneuvered the shuttle carefully toward the crippled ship's docking port. The Windwhisper was slowly tumbling, its attitude control completely gone. Matching the rotation and achieving a stable dock would require perfect timing and exceptional skill. On his first approach, a shifting asteroid forced Rodriguez to abort at the last second. The Windwhisper continued its slow tumble, each rotation taking it further from the rescue shuttle's optimal position. Sir, Specialist Morgan reported from engineering, they're venting atmosphere from their port section. Life support failure is accelerating. Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the shuttle's climate control. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes rescue operation that separated competent officers from exceptional ones. He thought about Commander Chen, wondering how she would have handled this situation. His eyes fell on the case containing her uniform, and he found himself thinking about the conversation Elder Thiss had related, about bravery and trust, and being worthy of the faith others placed in you. On his second approach, Rodriguez managed to get within 50 meters of the Windwhisper's docking port before another tumbling asteroid forced him to pull away. Time was running out, and he could hear the increasing desperation in the Zephyrian pilot's transmissions. Endeavor, our Cubs have lost consciousness. Please hurry. Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. When he opened them, his hands were steady on the controls. This time he would succeed. He had to. The third approach required threading the shuttle between 2 massive asteroids while matching the Windwhisper's complex rotation. Rodriguez felt time slow around him as he made micro-adjustments to the shuttle's trajectory, his mind calculating angles and velocities with crystal clarity. The docking clamps engaged with a satisfying thunk. Docking successful, Lieutenant Park announced. Sealed connection confirmed. Rodriguez allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of relief before focusing on the next challenge. Emergency team, get those people off that ship now. We've got maybe 20 minutes before another asteroid cluster comes through this area. The rescue proceeded with military efficiency. The adult Zephyrians were weak but conscious, helping to carry their unconscious cubs through the docking tunnel. Rodriguez himself carried the smallest cub, a tiny creature no bigger than a human infant, its gossamer wings folded tightly against its fragile body. As they prepared for departure, the senior Zephyrian passenger, a scientist named Dr. Zelth, noticed the case containing Commander Chen's uniform. "You brought the Guardian shell?" Dr. Zelth observed with wonder. The cub spoke truly of its power. Rodriguez started to explain that it was just a uniform, but something stopped him. Looking at the unconscious cubs, thinking about their faith in symbols and protection, he found himself saying instead, "Commander Chen believed that courage comes from the heart, but sometimes we all need reminders of what we're capable of." The return journey through the asteroid field was harrowing, with the shuttle's engines strained by the additional passengers and the need for rapid course changes. But Rodriguez navigated with newfound confidence, as if some of Commander Chen's legendary composure had somehow transferred to him. They emerged from the asteroid field to find a Federation rescue ship already en route, its captain expressing amazement that a mining station's emergency shuttle had successfully completed such a dangerous rescue operation. Back at the mining station, the Zephyrian medical team worked frantically to revive the cubs. Elder Thys stood vigil beside their treatment chambers, her entire body radiating anxiety. The adult survivors would recover fully, but the cubs' condition remained critical. Rodriguez found himself standing beside Elder Thys, still holding the case with Commander Chen's uniform. "Will they be all right?" "The healers are hopeful," Elder Thys replied, her voice carefully controlled. "You have given them a chance they would not have had otherwise. The nest owes you a debt beyond measure." As if responding to her words, one of the cubs stirred in its treatment chamber, its large eyes fluttering open. The healing staff chittered excitedly as vital signs stabilized across all three chambers. Elder Thys turned to Rodriguez with something approaching reverence. "You carried the Guardian shell with you, and it brought our young ones safely home." The cub's faith was well placed. Rodriguez looked down at the case, beginning to understand that Commander Chen's uniform had become something more than mere fabric and insignia. It had become a symbol of human reliability, of promises kept and trust honored. "The uniform will be returned to the cubs' care," he said quietly. "They're its proper guardians now." Elder Thys bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect among her people. "The nest will remember this day, Commander Rodriguez, and the Guardian shell will continue to watch over our young ones as it was meant to do." As the rescued Zephyrians recovered and the crisis passed into memory, Rodriguez found himself changed by the experience. He had proven himself capable of exceptional courage under pressure, but more importantly, he had learned to understand the power of symbols and the strength that comes from being worthy of others' faith. The uniform would indeed remain in the Zephyrian settlement, but its influence would spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. 2 years had passed since the rescue in the asteroid field, and the story of the Guardian shell had spread throughout the Zephyrian trade collective like ripples in a still pond. What started as Cub's fascination with Commander Chen's uniform had evolved into something approaching religious reverence among the younger generation of Zephyrians. The three cubs rescued by Commander Rodriguez had grown into confident juveniles, and they served as living testament to the uniform's protective power. They would gather other young Zephyrians around the carefully maintained display where the uniform was kept, telling the story of how the human Guardian shell had accompanied their rescue from certain death. Dr. Zelth, the scientist who had survived the Windwhisper incident, had become the uniform's primary caretaker. She had established a small shrine in the main nest chamber where the uniform was displayed in a climate-controlled case, surrounded by crystalline light-refracting sculptures that cast rainbow patterns across the dark blue fabric. Elder Thys watched these developments with growing concern. While she appreciated the cubs' faith and the positive influence the uniform seemed to have on their courage and behavior, she worried about the implications of treating a piece of human clothing as a sacred relic. Her concerns deepened when reports began arriving from other Zephyrian colonies throughout the sector. Young Zephyrians were requesting transfers to Kepler 442c specifically to see the Guardian shell. Some colonies had begun creating replicas based on detailed holographic recordings, though these copies lacked the emotional impact of the original. The situation came to a head when a formal delegation from the Zephyrian High Council arrived at the mining station, led by Archon Velter, the most senior political figure in the trade collective. The Archon was ancient even by Zephyrian standards, her gossamer wings bearing the faded patterns that marked centuries of accumulated wisdom. Commander Rodriguez received the delegation with full military honors, though privately he wondered what could have prompted such a high-level visit. The mining operation was running smoothly, production quotas were being exceeded, and relations between the human workers and Zephyrian settlers remained excellent. The answer became clear when Archon Velter requested a private meeting in the presence of the Guardian Shell. "Commander Rodriguez," the Archon began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries, "we must discuss this development regarding your predecessor's uniform. The situation has begun to affect our entire society in ways that concern our leadership." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure I understand, Archon. The uniform has brought comfort to your people, especially the young ones. I thought that was beneficial." "Indeed, it has provided comfort," Archon Velter acknowledged. "But consider the implications. Our young people now speak of human courage as if it were a force of nature, something mystical rather than simply the result of good training and strong character. They begin to view humans not as partners and allies, but as supernatural protectors." Elder Thys, who had been present for the meeting, interjected gently. "The Cubs mean no disrespect to our traditions, Archon. Their faith in the Guardian Shell has made them braver, more willing to attempt difficult tasks." "Yes," the Archon replied, "and therein lies the problem. They attempt these tasks not through confidence in their own abilities, but through faith in borrowed courage. What happens when that faith is tested? What happens if the Guardian Shell fails to protect someone?" Rodriguez began to understand the deeper implications. "You're concerned about dependency, about your people losing confidence in their own capabilities." "Precisely." Archon Velter moved closer to the display case, her ancient eyes studying the uniform with careful attention. "This garment represents something admirable about human nature, your species' willingness to stand firm in the face of danger, to accept responsibility for others' welfare. But these virtues must be cultivated from within, not borrowed from external symbols." The conversation was interrupted by urgent chiming from Rodriguez's communication system. Dr. Zelth's image appeared on the holographic display, her normally composed demeanor showing signs of distress. "Commander Archon, you must come quickly. There has been an accident at Mining Site 7. They arrived at the accident scene to find chaos. A tunnel collapse had trapped 6 workers, 3 humans and 3 Zephyrians, behind tons of rubble. Emergency teams were working frantically to clear the debris, but the unstable geology made the rescue extremely dangerous. What caught Rodriguez's attention immediately was the presence of nearly 24 young Zephyrians at the site perimeter. They stood in a tight group, their wings rustling with agitation, their large eyes fixed on something one of them was carrying. It was a replica of Commander Chen's uniform, hastily constructed but recognizable. Dr. Zelth approached the group, her voice gentle but firm. "Young ones, you should not be here. This is dangerous work." Kesset, one of the cubs rescued in the asteroid field and now a confident juvenile, stepped forward as the group's spokesperson. "We brought the Guardian Shell to protect our friends trapped below. The real one could not be moved from the nest, so we created this one to carry its power." Archon Velter observed this exchange with deep concern. The young Zephyrians clearly believed their replica uniform would somehow influence the rescue operation's outcome. Their faith was touching but potentially dangerous. If the rescue failed despite the presence of their Guardian Shell, it could shatter their worldview. The rescue team leader, a grizzled human engineer named Patterson, approached with an update. "Commander, we've managed to establish communication with the trapped workers. They're alive but running low on air. The problem is, the tunnel's geometry means we can only send one person in at a time, and the route is extremely unstable." Rodriguez studied the rescue plan Patterson had sketched out. The approach required someone small and agile enough to navigate the twisted wreckage, brave enough to risk further collapse, and skilled enough to set up life support and prepare the trapped workers for extraction. "I'll go," Rodriguez said immediately. "Sir, with respect, you're needed here to coordinate the overall operation," Patterson replied. I was thinking one of the junior engineers. No, the voice that interrupted was unexpected. Kesset had approached close enough to overhear their conversation. Commander Rodriguez cannot go alone. The Guardian Shell must accompany him. Rodriguez started to explain that the replica uniform couldn't actually help with the rescue, but Archon Velter placed a restraining hand on his arm. Her expression suggested she wanted to observe how this situation developed. The tunnel is too narrow for two people, Kesset, Rodriguez explained patiently. And even if it weren't, I couldn't risk a civilian life. Kesset's response surprised everyone present. Not me, Commander, the Guardian Shell itself. Commander Chen's words, as related by Elder Thys, were that courage comes from the heart, but the shell reminds us to be worthy of trust. If you carry it with you, it will remind you of the trust we place in you. Rodriguez found himself looking at the young Zephyrian with new understanding. This wasn't about magical protection or supernatural intervention. It was about the weight of responsibility, the power of symbols to focus the mind and strengthen resolve. He turned to Dr. Zelth. Could we retrieve the actual uniform, not for mystical protection, but as a reminder of the standards I need to meet? Dr. Zelth nodded immediately. The Guardian Shell can be here within minutes. As they waited for the uniform to arrive, Rodriguez found himself discussing the rescue plan with Kesset and the other young Zephyrians. Their questions were intelligent and their suggestions thoughtful. The uniform had indeed given them confidence, but it hadn't replaced their natural intelligence and problem-solving abilities. When Commander Chen's uniform arrived, Rodriguez held it for a moment, feeling the weight of fabric that had somehow become a symbol of human reliability and courage. He carefully folded it into a compact bundle that could be carried safely through the collapsed tunnel. The rescue operation that followed was harrowing. Rodriguez navigated through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders, while loose rubble threatened to bring down additional sections of tunnel. When he finally reached the trapped workers, their relief was palpable. They had been trapped for 6 hours, and their emergency air supplies were nearly exhausted. Setting up the life support equipment in the cramped space required careful coordination and steady nerves. Rodriguez found himself thinking about Commander Chen, about the faith the Zephyrian cubs placed in her uniform, about the responsibility that came with being worthy of that trust. One by one, the trapped workers were extracted through the tunnel Rodriguez had secured. The operation took 12 hours total, but all 6 workers survived without serious injury. When Rodriguez finally emerged from the tunnel, exhausted and covered in rock dust, but carrying Commander Chen's uniform safely, the young Zephyrians erupted in celebration. To them, this was proof of the Guardian Shell's power. But Archon Velter, watching Rodriguez's interaction with the young ones, began to understand something different. The uniform's true power wasn't supernatural, it was inspirational. It reminded humans and Zephyrians alike of the highest ideals both species could achieve. As the rescue teams packed up their equipment and the miners returned to their duties, Archon Velter approached Rodriguez with a thoughtful expression. Commander, I believe I have been viewing this situation incorrectly. The Guardian Shell's influence is not creating dependency, it is creating aspiration. Your young people see what humans can achieve and are inspired to reach for similar excellence themselves. Rodriguez nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. And our people are reminded that others are watching, counting on us to live up to their expectations. It raises the bar for everyone. Indeed, the Archon agreed. Perhaps the Guardian Shell should remain with your people, but not hidden away. Let it serve as a bridge between our species, a reminder of what we can accomplish together. Elder Thys, who had been listening to their conversation, suggested a solution that would prove prophetic. What if the Guardian Shell were to travel, not just to remain here, but to visit other colonies, other joint operations between our peoples? Let its story spread, but let its presence be shared. Rodriguez looked down at the uniform in his hands, already beginning to envision how such a program might work. Commander Chen's simple dress blues were becoming something far greater than she could ever have imagined, a symbol of interspecies cooperation, and the heights both humans and Zephyrians could reach when they supported each other. The decision made that day would transform not just the relationship between the mining station and the local Zephyrian settlement, but the entire dynamic between their two species across the galaxy. The Guardian Shell Cultural Exchange Program, as it came to be officially known, launched 6 months after the mining accident with surprising support from both Human Colonial Command and the Zephyrian High Council. What had started as cubs guarding a forgotten uniform had evolved into a formal diplomatic initiative spanning 3 star systems. Commander Sarah Chen, now serving as an instructor at the Naval Academy on Earth, received the invitation to join the program with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. Her old uniform had apparently become a traveling ambassador, complete with its own diplomatic escort and ceremonial protocols. "You realize this is completely unprecedented," Admiral Morrison told her during their briefing session. "We've had cultural exchange programs before, but never one centered around a piece of clothing. The Xenosociology department is fascinated." Sarah reviewed the mission parameters on her tablet. The program called for the uniform to visit 12 different joint human-Zephyrian operations across the frontier, accompanied by a small team including herself, Dr. Zelth, and Kesset, the young Zephyrian who had become something of a spokesperson for his generation's relationship with human culture. "The psychological impact reports are remarkable," Sarah continued reading. "Zephyrian productivity at joint operations has increased by an average of 23% when the uniform is present. Human safety compliance has improved by 31%. Both species report improved morale and cooperation." Admiral Morrison leaned back in his chair. "The High Council wants to understand whether this effect can be replicated or if it's unique to your particular uniform. They're also curious about long-term sustainability. Will the positive effects fade over time?" Sarah found herself thinking about the cubs she had met 3 years ago, now grown into confident juveniles who served as cultural ambassadors themselves. "I think they're asking the wrong questions, Admiral. This isn't about the uniform itself. It's about what the uniform represents. Human reliability, willingness to sacrifice for others, keeping faith with allies. And what the Zephyrians represent in return," Admiral Morrison added. "Loyalty, community support, faith in partnership. The uniform has become a symbol of the best qualities both species bring to their relationship." The first stop on the cultural exchange tour was the asteroid mining operation in the Vega system, where human engineering teams worked alongside Zephyrian geological specialists to extract rare metals from the system's debris field. The operation had been struggling with coordination problems and declining productivity until news of the Guardian Shell program reached them. Captain Williams, the human operation commander, greeted Sarah's team with obvious relief. "Commander Chen, I have to admit I was skeptical about this whole thing until I saw the change in our Zephyrian partners. Ever since they heard about the Guardian Shell's arrival, their enthusiasm has been incredible." The Zephyrian operation coordinator, Engineer Talesh, showed even more visible excitement. "Commander Chen, the stories we have heard from Kepler 442c speak of your uniform's protective power and the courage it inspires. Our young workers have requested special permission to witness its presence." Sarah felt the weight of expectation that had become familiar over the past months. Everywhere they traveled, both species seemed to view her uniform as something approaching a holy relic. The responsibility was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. The ceremony held that evening in the operation's main assembly hall demonstrated the uniform's remarkable ability to bridge species differences. Young Zephyrians sat beside human apprentices, all listening intently as Kesset retold the story of the asteroid rescue and the mining accident. The tale had grown in the telling, acquiring details and dramatic flourishes that made Sarah smile despite herself. But what impressed her most was how the story emphasized cooperation between species rather than human superiority. Kesset was careful to highlight how Zephyrian skills had been essential to both rescue operations, how the uniform's power came from the trust and partnership it represented rather than from any inherent human advantage. Dr. Zelth, now recognized as one of the leading experts on human Zephyrian psychological integration, had been conducting detailed studies throughout their tour. Her findings challenged many assumptions about interspecies relationships. "The uniform's effect is not about dependency or hero worship," she explained to Sarah as they reviewed the day's observations. "It functions as what human psychologists call a focusing object, something that helps both species remember their highest aspirations and best behaviors." Sarah watched through the assembly hall's windows as mixed groups of human and Zephyrian workers continued their discussions long after the formal ceremony had ended. The uniform sat in its display case at the front of the room, drawing occasional glances, but no longer the center of attention. The real focus was on the connections being made between individuals. "Look at that," Sarah pointed to a group where a young human technician was demonstrating some piece of equipment to three fascinated Zephyrian apprentices. "They're not thinking about mystical protection or borrowed courage. They're just sharing knowledge and building friendships." Dr. Zelth followed her gaze and nodded approvingly. "This is what we hope to achieve. The Guardian Shell gives them permission to trust each other, and once that trust is established, it becomes self-sustaining." Their next stop was a research station in the Ross 128 system, where scientists from both species were collaborating on terraforming technology. Here, the uniform's influence took on a different character. Rather than inspiring operational cooperation, it seemed to encourage intellectual risk-taking and creative collaboration. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the human research director, explained the phenomenon during their first day at the station. "Before the Guardian Shell program reached us, our teams were polite but cautious with each other. Everyone stuck to their established specialties. But something about your uniform story, about taking risks to help others, has encouraged cross-pollination between disciplines." The evidence was visible in the station's main laboratory, where human atmospheric specialists worked side by side with Zephyrian biological engineers on projects that required both expertise sets. The breakthrough development they were most excited about, a hybrid atmosphere processor that could adapt to multiple environmental conditions, had emerged from exactly this kind of collaboration. Professor Yathara, the senior Zephyrian researcher, had an interesting perspective on the uniform's influence. "The Guardian Shell reminds us that innovation requires courage. To propose new ideas, to question established methods, to risk failure in pursuit of greater success. These all require the same kind of bravery displayed by Commander Chen and Commander Rodriguez." Sarah found this interpretation particularly fascinating because it extended the uniform's symbolic power beyond emergency situations into everyday professional excellence. The Cub's original fascination with her protection shell had evolved into something much more sophisticated, a cultural touchstone that encouraged both species to aspire to their best selves. The third stop on their tour brought unexpected challenges. The agricultural colony on Proxima Centauri b was experiencing significant problems with crop failures and ecosystem instability. The joint human-Zephyrian agricultural team was under enormous pressure to solve these problems before the colony became unsustainable. Colony Administrator Jackson met Sarah's team with barely concealed frustration. "Commander Chen, I hope you understand that we're facing a real crisis here. Our last 3 harvests have failed, and we're running out of time to develop solutions. I'm not sure how much help a uniform is going to be in this situation." Sarah had encountered this skepticism before, practical-minded individuals who saw the Guardian Shell program as frivolous superstition. She had learned that the best response was to let the uniform's influence speak for itself. The agricultural teams were indeed under tremendous stress. Human soil scientists and Zephyrian biological specialists had been working around the clock for months, but their efforts remained fragmented and poorly coordinated. Each group was so focused on their own expertise that they had failed to develop integrated solutions. The evening ceremony took place in the colony's community center, with both the human colonists and the local Zephyrian agricultural specialists in attendance. But instead of the usual celebration of cooperation and partnership, the atmosphere was tense and worried. Kessit, now experienced in reading the mood of mixed groups, adapted his storytelling approach. Rather than focusing on dramatic rescues, he emphasized the patient, methodical work that went into successful operations. The careful planning, the attention to detail, the willingness to trust partners' expertise even when you didn't fully understand it. The turning point came when one of the young Zephyrian agricultural specialists, inspired by the stories of cross-species cooperation, approached the human soil chemistry team with a question about mineral absorption rates. The conversation that followed revealed a fundamental misunderstanding that had been hampering their work for months. Within hours, mixed teams were forming spontaneously to tackle specific problems. The uniform's presence hadn't provided magical solutions, but it had created an atmosphere where people felt safe to admit their limitations and ask for help. Dr. Zelth documented the phenomenon in her research notes. The Guardian Shell's power lies not in supernatural intervention, but in its ability to remind individuals that seeking and providing help is a sign of strength, not weakness. It normalizes vulnerability and mutual dependence. By the end of their week at the agricultural colony, three major breakthrough solutions had emerged from the new collaborative approach. More importantly, the teams had established working relationships and communication protocols that would serve them long after the uniform moved on to its next destination. Administrator Jackson's farewell was much more gracious than his greeting had been. "Commander Chen, I owe you an apology. I thought this program was just elaborate theater, but you've given our people something they desperately needed, permission to work together instead of just alongside each other." As their transport ship carried them toward the next stop on their tour, Sarah found herself reflecting on how her simple military uniform had become something far beyond anything she could have imagined. It wasn't just inspiring cooperation between humans and Zephyrians. It was teaching both species new ways to think about partnership, trust, and shared responsibility. "Do you think this will last?" she asked Dr. Zelth as they watched the stars wheel past their viewport. "Or will the effect fade once people get used to the idea?" Dr. Zelth considered the question carefully. "The uniform itself may become less important over time, but the lessons it has taught will endure. Your species and mine are learning new ways to relate to each other, new patterns of cooperation and mutual support. Those changes become self-reinforcing." Kesset, who had been listening to their conversation, added his own perspective. "The Guardian Shell was never about the uniform, Commander Chen. It was about the promise you made when you wore it, to be worthy of others' trust. That promise is now shared by all who have been touched by its story." Sarah nodded, understanding that her uniform had become the catalyst for something much larger than any single piece of cloth could contain. The real Guardian Shell was the network of relationships and shared values that had grown up around its symbol. But none of them could have predicted the crisis that would test those relationships in ways no one had imagined, or how the uniform's influence would prove crucial in the most unexpected circumstances. The crisis began with what should have been routine communication from the Frontier Research Station at Wolf 359. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the station commander, appeared on the emergency channel with her usual composed demeanor, but Sarah Chen immediately noticed the tension in her voice. "Guardian Shell team, this is Research Station Prometheus. We have an urgent situation developing that requires your immediate assistance. A first contact scenario has gone badly wrong." Sarah's blood ran cold. First contact protocols were among the most delicate procedures in human space exploration. A mishandled encounter with a new species could have catastrophic consequences for interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. "Details, Commander Harper," Sarah responded immediately. Harper's image flickered as their ship's communication array struggled with the distance. 18 hours ago, our long-range sensors detected an unknown vessel entering the Wolf system. The ship appeared to be in distress, massive hull damage, life support failing. We initiated standard rescue protocols. Dr. Zelth and Kesset moved closer to listen, their expressions growing grave. Both understood the implications of a failed first contact better than most. Harper continued, "The species calls themselves the Corvani. They're unusual, highly aggressive, militaristic culture, but also intensely honor-bound. Their ship was carrying diplomatic refugees fleeing some kind of civil war. When we tried to help, they interpreted our rescue efforts as an attack." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Current status: they've barricaded themselves in Cargo Bay 7 with some of our equipment. They're not exactly holding hostages, but they've made it clear they'll defend themselves against any perceived threat. The problem is, their definition of threat seems to include basic station operations." Kesset spoke up, his voice careful and measured. "Commander Harper, have they responded to any communication attempts?" "That's part of the problem," Harper replied. "Their translator systems are damaged, and ours can't seem to interface properly with their technology. We're getting fragments of meaning, but nothing coherent enough for real dialogue." Sarah reviewed the tactical situation on her display. Wolf 359 Research Station housed over 400 humans and Zephyrians conducting deep space research. If the Corvani misunderstood the station's defensive capabilities as aggressive intent, The situation could escalate into violence that would destroy any possibility of peaceful contact. Estimated time to arrival, Sarah asked her pilot. 16 hours at maximum burn, Commander. Too long, Dr. Zelth observed. If the Corvani are as honor-bound as Commander Harper suggests, their patience may not last that long. Sarah found herself staring at the case containing her uniform, wondering how a piece of clothing could possibly help with such a delicate situation. The Guardian Shell program had been successful with species that already knew and trusted humanity, but the Corvani had no context for human behavior or Zephyrian cooperation. Kesset, reading her expression, offered a perspective that surprised her. Commander Chen, perhaps the Guardian Shell's power is not in its familiarity, but in its unfamiliarity. The Corvani have no preconceptions about human military dress or what it represents. Explain, Sarah said. Every species has symbols of honor, courage, and responsibility. The Guardian Shell has become such a symbol for humans and Zephyrians. Perhaps it can communicate those concepts to the Corvani even without shared language. Dr. Zelth nodded thoughtfully. The uniform represents everything we've learned about interspecies cooperation, if we can somehow demonstrate its significance. Their conversation was interrupted by another transmission from Research Station Prometheus. This time, Commander Harper looked genuinely worried. Guardian Shell team, the situation has deteriorated. The Corvani have begun some kind of ritual preparation. Our xenobiologist thinks they may be preparing for honorable death rather than surrender to perceived enemies. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to her 3 years earlier. Commander Harper, we're going to attempt something unprecedented. When we arrive, I want you to arrange for me to meet with the Corvani face-to-face, wearing my dress uniform. Commander, that could be extremely dangerous. We don't know how they'll react to. That's exactly why it might work, Sarah interrupted. They're expecting deception, expecting hidden threats. A human officer presenting herself openly in formal dress might be the kind of gesture they can understand and respect. The next 16 hours were spent in intensive preparation. Dr. Zelth consulted her extensive database of xenopsychological profiles, looking for common patterns in how militaristic species responded to formal protocols. Kesset worked with the ship's communications specialists to develop pictographic symbols that might convey basic concepts of peace, honor, and mutual respect. Sarah spent the time reviewing everything they had learned about the uniform's symbolic power. It had become a bridge between species, a reminder of shared values, a focus for the best qualities humans and Zephyrians could achieve. Now it would need to serve as a universal language for concepts that transcended cultural boundaries. Research Station Prometheus appeared on their viewports as they dropped out of hyperspace, its modular structure gleaming against the red dwarf star's angry light. The unknown Corvani vessel was visible nearby, its hull scarred by what looked like weapon impacts and meteor damage. Commander Harper met them at the docking bay, her relief visible. Thank God you're here. The Corvani have been increasingly agitated. Our linguist managed to parse a few words, something about death before dishonor and clean ending. We think they're preparing for some kind of ritual suicide. Sarah had changed into her dress uniform during the final approach. The familiar weight of the fabric, the precise arrangement of insignia and decoration, felt different now than it had years ago. It was no longer just clothing. It was a statement of principles, a promise of honor and reliability. I'll need direct access to their location, Sarah said. No escort, no obvious backup. If this is going to work, it has to be a gesture of trust. Dr. Zelth attached a small recording device to Sarah's uniform jacket. Whatever happens, we want to document this. The xenosociological implications could be enormous. Kesset approached with something unexpected in his hands, a small replica of Commander Chen's uniform that he had been crafting during their journey. For courage, Commander, not your courage but theirs, so they may see that you understand the power of symbols. Sarah accepted the miniature uniform with genuine emotion. The young Zephyrian who had once been a frightened cub rescued from certain death was now helping to shape first contact with an entirely new species. The walk to Cargo Bay 7 felt endless. Station personnel they passed looked at her with expressions ranging from admiration to concern to bewilderment. Sarah's dress uniform, normally reserved for formal ceremonies, seemed almost absurdly out of place in the industrial corridors of a research station. But as she approached the sealed cargo bay, Sarah began to understand the psychological impact her appearance might have. She looked formal, official, but not threatening. Her uniform spoke of ceremony and protocol rather than combat readiness. The cargo bay doors opened to reveal a scene that took Sarah's breath away. 7 Corvani stood in formation around what appeared to be a ritual space they had created from station equipment. The aliens themselves were imposing, tall, heavily built, with elaborate cranial ridges and skin that seemed to shift color with their emotions. What caught Sarah's attention immediately was their own use of formal dress. Each Corvani wore what were clearly ceremonial garments, flowing robes decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to glow with their own light. They had prepared for this meeting as carefully as she had. The largest Corvani, clearly their leader, stepped forward and spoke in a deep, resonant voice. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone conveyed formal greeting and careful assessment. Sarah responded by presenting herself according to human military protocol, standing at attention, stating her name, rank, and peaceful intentions. She then added something that felt right in the moment. She held up Kesset's miniature uniform and gestured between it and her own clothing. The Corvani leader's skin color shifted to what Dr. Zelth would later identify as surprise and interest. He spoke again, this time in a questioning tone, and gestured toward Sarah's uniform. Understanding flooded through Sarah like a revelation. The Corvani were asking about the significance of her formal dress, trying to understand what it represented in human culture. This was exactly the kind of honor-based interaction their military society could comprehend and respect. Sarah began to speak, knowing they couldn't understand her words, but hoping they could read her gestures and expressions. She told them about the uniform's journey, how it had started as simple military dress, but had become a symbol of protection, cooperation, and mutual responsibility between species. She gestured to the miniature uniform, then to herself, then toward the station beyond the cargo bay walls. Slowly, carefully, she tried to convey that humans and their allies didn't see the Corvani as enemies, but as potential friends in need of assistance. The breakthrough came when the Corvani leader removed something from his own ceremonial robes, a small, intricately carved object that seemed to pulse with inner light. He held it beside Kesset's miniature uniform, and Sarah understood that he was showing her his people's equivalent symbol. Dr. Zelth would later identify the object as a honor stone, a sacred item carried by Corvani military leaders to remind them of their duty to protect their people and maintain their society's values. The parallel to Sarah's uniform was unmistakable. What followed was a slow, careful process of symbolic communication that lasted for hours. Using gestures, expressions, and shared objects, Sarah and the Corvani leader began to establish basic concepts of mutual respect and peaceful intent. The turning point came when Sarah did something that felt natural, but which would later be studied as a masterpiece of interspecies diplomacy. She removed her uniform jacket and offered it to the Corvani leader to examine, while accepting his honor stone to hold in return. The gesture of mutual trust broke through the last barriers of suspicion. The Corvani leader's skin shifted to colors that Dr. Zelth identified as relief and approval. He spoke to his companions, and their formal military posture relaxed into something more approachable. By the time the station's linguists had established proper communication protocols, the foundation for peaceful contact had already been laid through the language of shared symbols and mutual respect. Commander Harper later described the scene as the most extraordinary display of diplomatic intuition I've ever witnessed. The Corvani refugees, it turned out, had fled a civil war that pitted different factions of their society against each other. They had interpreted the research station's rescue attempts as another military threat because their recent experience had taught them to expect deception and betrayal. Sarah's formal presentation, combined with her willingness to share her most valued symbol, had convinced them that humans operated according to codes of honor they could understand and respect. The cultural exchange that followed would establish protocols for future contact between humanity and the Corvani Confederation. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the uniform's symbolic power could transcend the specific relationship between humans and Zephyrians. Dr. Zelth's final report on the Guardian Shell program would conclude that they had discovered something fundamental about interspecies communication. Symbols of honor, courage, and mutual responsibility seemed to be universal concepts that could bridge even the most radical differences in culture and biology. Sarah Chen's dress uniform, which had started its journey as a forgotten piece of clothing in a Zephyrian settlement, had become proof that the best qualities of any species could inspire and unite beings throughout the galaxy. Years later, when the Corvani established their first permanent embassy in human space, they brought with them a gift, a ceremonial honor stone sized and shaped to fit perfectly alongside Commander Chen's uniform in its display case. The two objects, representing entirely different civilizations, sat side by side as proof that courage, honor, and the willingness to protect others were not uniquely human traits, but universal values that could unite all thinking beings. The cubs who had first guarded the uniform as their treasure had been right in ways they never could have imagined. It truly was a guardian shell, not just for humans and Zephyrians, but for the possibility of understanding and cooperation between all the diverse forms of life scattered across the stars.